Hi everyone. My name's Howard Amos. I hope you can hear me. And then this talk is about Russian media in exile, how to report about Russia from outside Russia. If you don't know, I would just introduce myself. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Moscow Times, which we write in English, but it is it's a Russian media organization, and we write about Russia. I've only actually been chief editor for 3 months, so from about a month after the invasion of Ukraine began. But I worked at the Moscow Times as my first reporting job about 10 years ago. And I've since worked in lots of other places, but that was my first job. I'm going to speak for about 15-20 minutes and then open it up for questions. And I was going to talk a bit about the Moscow Times and how we've experienced the invasion and leaving Russia, and how we're now trying to report about Russia from outside Russia, and a little bit about independent Russian media in general, the consequences for them have been of the invasion. Because Moscow Times is we write in English, so it's not a Russian language site. The consequences for us have been a little bit different from they have been from other Russian media outlets. But so I'll try and sort of cover both. Right. So the Moscow Times is, for those of you who don't know, originally it was a newspaper. It was set up in 1991 after the collapse of the Soviet Union, or around the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it was based in Moscow and writes about Russia in English for an audience which it's always been a mixture of foreigners living in Moscow, people abroad, mostly in the US, the UK, and other English-speaking countries who are interested in Russia, and Russians as well. Often when I was reporting for the Moscow Times, often people would say to me, "Oh, I learned English reading the Moscow Times." So it sort of has a foot both in Russia, like a Russian audience, and abroad. It was certainly at the beginning it was in very traditional newspaper format. It's gradually, changed with the times, and gradually became smaller in the 2000s. It shed a lot of staff, particularly in the 2008 crisis, and then it went to a weekly paper, and then it went entirely online. So for the last 3 years, or a bit more than 3 years, it's been entirely online. Like a lot of, basically all independent journalists, the Moscow Times reporters and staff left Russia in the weeks after the beginning of the invasion. I won't go into details, but obviously there were new laws passed, which means that calling the war a war can theoretically mean you end up spending 15 years in a Russian prison. The independent media that was left in Russia at that point, at the start of the war, there were sort of three. Some were shut down. So like Echo Moskvy, Novaya Gazeta, some of two of the most famous independent news media were closed down by their owners. And in terms of foreign media, most of the foreign correspondents in Russia left. There are a few left, but the overwhelming majority of English-speaking foreign correspondents left. And then independent media outlets that didn't close down, they also fled abroad. So at the moment, there's what's left of the Russian independent media is based in places like Yerevan, Tbilisi, the Baltics, and in Europe. In terms of the Moscow Times, although I wasn't the chief editor at that point, our staff left about 10 days after the start of the invasion, and people went all over the place. So from having a newsroom in Moscow, we ended up with people in Bishkek, people in Yerevan, people in Istanbul, people in Riga, Amsterdam, and the United Kingdom. So suddenly people are thrown to all different parts of Europe and Asia. At the beginning, in the media, I think it was fair to say that it was similar for most media outlets in the weeks after the beginning of the war. It was all about it was crisis. So you were just trying to cover the news as best as possible in the circumstances. But obviously, as the months have gone on, then the sort of new normal has emerged, and from what some people assume would be a temporary situation has now become more or less a permanent situation. And I think people, including the Moscow Times, are beginning to think about how you work in these new circumstances. So it's not just day to day. People are trying to think a bit more about what you do with the various restrictions that have been introduced and the fact that you're outside of Russia. I think a lot of people are still hoping that it would be possible to go back at some point. I think probably that's more likely for foreigners rather than Russians, because the Russian government is concerned above all about independent reporting in Russian rather than in foreign languages. In terms, I want to say a couple of words about what the changes mean for the Moscow Times, what changes we have made. I mean, apart from the fact that everyone's in different places and we're very much in a sort of remote working mode, a bit like during the pandemic, we haven't made any major changes to the format of how we report, or like what the website looks like, or things like that. But obviously the major challenge is like in terms of sourcing. So when you're reporting, you obviously can't go to events or talk to people in person, or meet people and cultivate sources, etc., etc. Everything is done by messages, over the phone. There's a lot more focus, obviously, on social media and the information you get from social media. And when I was thinking about, so I mean, in essence, we haven't made a lot of changes, but it's something we're thinking about. When I was thinking about what to say at this talk, one of the things that came to mind is that the Moscow Times has traditionally been a place where the reporters, the staff, are both Russians and foreigners, usually UK or English or Americans. So it's been a mix, and inevitably the Russian, or not inevitably, but often the Russians have better sources and are better reporters, and the foreigners are better at writing. So it's quite a nice synergy. But I think what the current situation means at the moment that there's much less room for foreigners. So I think the Moscow Times is going to be most of the reporters will end up being Russians who have an existing network of sources in Russia and understand how the country works, rather than foreigners who are becoming acquainted with that, because obviously outside the country you can't do that. So that in terms, I think that will be a big change for the Moscow Times, and I'm sure there will be others as well in terms of format, but we haven't done anything as yet. And then moving on to perhaps more interestingly, sort of independent Russian media in general. They have, I think it's fair to say, they have a far more serious set of problems. So for those independent Russian media outlets who didn't shut down but moved abroad, one of their major issues is the fact that they're blocked in Russia. So most of these independent Russian outlets have been blocked, so they can no longer be accessed by anyone inside Russia, except if you use a VPN. And obviously, Russia has also blocked major social media networks: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. So that creates a whole host of problems for these outlets in terms of reaching their audiences. And inevitably, like one of the reactions, I don't know how, I think to a certain extent this is conscious, to a certain extent it's just fostered by necessity, but this leads to a change in format. So the most obvious things to me have been, since the start of the war, so the social networks that haven't been blocked are used far more often. So above all, I think that's Telegram. which, I mean, there are some news outlets which seem to almost exclusively function on Telegram. The websites are, I think, less important. There's less emphasis being put on websites. So often I look at independent Russian media outlets, and often the breaking news appears first on their Telegram channels, and sometimes the websites look positively sort of empty. There's much more going on in Telegram. And then another interesting trend, I think, is newsletters, like email newsletters, because obviously that's a way of reaching your audience that hasn't been blocked. Like Meduza, the big independent Russian media outlet, they've launched a couple of new newsletters. There's a website called The Bell, which was set up a few years ago, which is always focused on newsletters. And that's very much an interesting way to reach audiences who might not bother to use VPNs to look at websites. Which I say, sort of in some ways it reminds me of the samizdat in the Soviet Union. It's a sort of like old school technology which might have a renaissance as a way to evade these censorships. Another thing I've seen discussed is attempts to make VPNs more accessible. Some VPNs, as I understand in Russia, don't work very well, even some of the paid ones. So I think I know that some people are exploring ways to make them more accessible, whether that's paying for subscriptions for audience members to use VPNs, or somehow integrating it into the, I'm not technically expert, but somehow integrating it into the website to allow, to make it much easier to use. There's Dozh TV Rain was the big independent Russian television channel, and I know I'm not sure, they are relaunching in Europe in the coming months, as far as I understand, and I know they've been talking about using YouTube much more, because YouTube also hasn't been blocked inside Russia, so I think I'm sure they will use it as their main medium to reach a Russian audience. Russian media outlets, the other thing which I mentioned briefly was that independent Russian journalists, I think, are obviously far more at risk than foreigners reporting about Russia. There are a tiny number of independent Russian journalists in Russia still operating openly, whereas there are a handful of foreigners still in Russia operating openly. To be perfectly honest, I hope that the Moscow Times can one day go back to Moscow, because one of the paper's calling cards was the fact that they were in Russia and they cover things more in detail than foreign outlets. It's difficult to predict, but I think a lot of people are hoping that it might be possible to go back at some point. And finally, the other thing about the Russian independent media outlets, in terms of changes, has been the destruction of their financial models. They were always quite secretive about where they got their money, because it was a source of vulnerability and politically sensitive. But some independent Russian media outlets had been operating via crowdfunding and via donations from people inside Russia, and now not only the website's blocked, but and it's no longer possible. It's transferring money in and out of Russia is not only extremely complicated, but often impossible. So these outlets are having to rethink the way they operate from a financial point of view. Inevitably, I think what's going to happen is many of them, I think, had Western grants, and I'm sure those grants are now going to become probably the major way in which they're funded, plus any donations they can raise from emigres, only Russians who've left Russia. Probably, there's for all media outlets outside Russia, there's the constant risk that as time goes on, you become more divorced from the reality of what's going on in Russia, and your coverage gets skewed accordingly. And that's something I'm sure everyone will be aware of. But I think probably the funding issue is going to be a very serious one for a lot of these Russian media outlets, who, particularly as the tension fades from the war in Ukraine and what's going on in Russia, which it will inevitably do. That's pretty much everything I wanted to say. In conclusion, to be honest, I'm not that optimistic about the possibility of reporting from Russia outside Russia over the long term. Obviously, it's possible, and people will try and do it, and it will have some value, but it's very difficult to. I think it's something very difficult to sustain over the long run. But as I've said, I think some of the most interesting things will be the sort of technological innovations that will inevitably follow from these outlets trying to reach their audiences. Whether that's email newsletters or Telegram or other things, I think that's a very interesting area to watch. That was everything. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions.
So I was looking at the site and I only saw some Google AdSense type advertising. Has that always been the case, and has that been enough for you to cover expenses? Because I also noticed that most of your readers are from USA, but a bulk are also from Russia, and I understand Russian revenue has dried down.
Yeah, so I mean, according to Google, the bulk of the readers from the US. The caveat there is that we don't know how many people are using VPNs to say they're in the US, so they might be in other places. Like that's true of the Moscow Times, and it's even more true of like Russian media outlets. It's very difficult to understand where your readership is. The Moscow Times itself is, it's the owner is a Dutch guy. Is the same person who set up the Moscow Times in the early 90s, and the newspaper is actually run via a foundation at the moment. So it's a non-profit. So the revenue we raise from advertising goes some way to covering our expenditure, but doesn't cover it all. We also exist off of grants, and we have done for the last 3 or 4 years.
Hello, I try to ask you a hard and most common question. But to your mind, what is the future for Russian media in exile and is not exile too?
Sorry, say it again.
What is the future of Russian media for in exile and not exile too?
Well, I mean, Russian media that's not in exile, it's all state. It's either state-owned or it's media that is not critical of the government of the Kremlin, and follows the rules about not calling the war a war, about calling it a special military operation or whatever. So inside Russia, I think it's fair to say there's no independent media left. I mean, there are some small exceptions, but that is basically true at this stage. And independent media, Russian media abroad. I mean, as I said, I'm not. I mean, there's quite a lot. Despite all the political repression in Russia over the last 5 to 10 years, there is a surprising amount. There were a surprising amount of independent media organizations in Russia that were finding a way to operate. Whether that was financially, whether that was through crowdfunding, or whether it's from Western grants. Like there was a surprising amount still operating more or less freely. So they're now all abroad, and I think probably what you'll see over the next couple of years, there will be fewer of them. I'm not sure if they can sustain, if there's enough money and interest there to sustain that many organizations, but I'm sure some of them will survive and do the best they can. I mean, there are limits on how much they can do. I know some of them still have reporters in Russia who operate, without bylines and as much in the secret as they can. so that presumably that will continue. So there has some connection with people inside the country, but I think it's going to be very difficult to remain like kind of in touch with what's going on. So inevitably over time, I think the quality will like deteriorate. It might happen very slowly, but I think it's probably inevitable, that process.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I was also wondering about potential attacks, cyber attacks against your team, against the website.
Mm.
And do you see much of that? Because like Moscow's capabilities in this are really praised, but
I mean, since I've been in charge, we haven't seen anything like that. I think it has happened in the past, but it's not. It tends to be not something. I mean, I think the Moscow Times has always been this sort of media outlet which kind of slightly falls between the cracks. It's not like Russian independent media because we don't write in Russian, and it's not foreign media because it's a Russian organization. So it's like it's not something that and that has its downsides as well as its good sides. But I think we escape a lot of things like that because of it. The other thing I should say was the Moscow Times. They recently launched a Russian service, so it now has a Russian version or Russian service, which is more or less a separate organization. So they write in Russian. They have obviously all left Russia, but they're based in Amsterdam, and they are actually blocked inside Russia. So also it's probably pointless to attack websites that are blocked inside Russia. I mean, it seems a waste of time.
Another one. I mean, I'm really interested about revenue models. If I made this one.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So, you guys are experts in Russia from the point of view of the West. So, do you use that? Do you maybe try to commercialize that knowledge that you only have uniquely, and you can write great English language reports, close to research studies on Russia, and raise revenue for your operations as well?
That's an interesting question. I'm not aware that again, I've only been there for a couple of months. I mean, that's not something they ever did when I was there as a reporter, and that's not something they do at the moment, or they have done in the recent years. I mean, there have been, when it was based in Russia, there were attempts to do things like conferences, use because the brand is quite well recognized. It's been around for 30 years. It's been doing more or less the same thing for 30 years, and it has this sort of niche where it has, more detail in English than you would find in almost any other Western media outlet, but in English, so it's accessible. So it has very good brand recognition. So yeah, there have been attempts to monetize that. The conferences is the one that comes to mind. They've also produced sort of magazine type supplements and things which are maybe more analytical with more advertising and stuff in them. But again, it's all a bit tricky now that we're not in Russia. I think that complicates that sort of thing a lot. But yeah, it's a interesting idea.
I mean, there are a bunch of guys sitting in Texas under a name called Stratfor and writing think tank stuff. So
right. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Just wondering.
Thanks.
Hello. I was wondering what are the audiences that you used to target and you are targeting now, and since I understand that you lost the majority of your audience in Russia since it was blocked, is there any exit strategy that you think of?
Yeah, so the question of audience in the Moscow Times has always been an interesting one because it's and they've done lots of surveys over the years trying to figure out exactly who the audience was. But it's always been this slightly odd mixture, as I sort of said, of foreigners living in Russia who maybe don't speak Russian but who want more detail about what's going on in Russia, inside Russia. People abroad who are interested in Russia, so whether that's academics, people at think tanks, journalists, like whoever. There's a community of people abroad who are interested in it, and Russians who for whatever reason, want to read about Russia in English. So yeah, and how the audience, well, the main change we assume to the audience since the beginning of the war has been the fact that lots of foreigners have left Russia. So there is, and so the expat community, for want of a better word, in Russia, which was traditionally seen, I think, as the bulk of the audience for the Moscow Times, now no longer exists. Well, I mean, there are some people some expats who have stayed, some foreigners who have stayed in Russia, and I think, but a lot have obviously left. Maybe they are still interested in reading about Russia in English. So even if they're not inside Russia, doesn't mean they're not necessarily interested. But with time, presumably, they will move on, and that part of the audience will be significantly smaller than it was before. I mean, having said that, I think that's probably been a trend for the last 7 or 8 years, at least, of the number of foreigners in Russia sort of shrinking gradually. So it's not an entirely new phenomenon. Yeah, and the second it was sort of exit strategy. I mean, because the Moscow Times is run as a non-profit organization, like, we are not so tied to audience, and I think, whatever happens, there will be a market. There will be an audience for this the sort of reporting that we do and the level of detail that we go into. So it's not absolutely key for us that, if audience numbers fall a little bit, we'll readjust in terms of, expenditure and then continue. So I don't think leaving Russia is going to have sort of catastrophic consequences for the audience. I mean, to be honest, the other thing I should say is that the war and all the interest in Russia has seen a huge, like, audience. The last 6 months has been, like, enormous. I don't know the exact figures, but it's almost certainly record numbers of viewers for the website. So all the attention on Russia at the moment, which is, will fade slightly, but is unlikely to go away, is I mean, in terms of audience, is a good thing for us. I don't know if that answered your question.
I'm Valentina, I'm a citizen of Russia, citizen of Eastern Siberia. I remember your newspaper from the early 90s in our family, from the school, and yeah, from early 90s. And since the beginning of the war, we read all stuff about what's going on in Telegram. But really nothing's changed in the political situation. Do you think could media help in any way?
To change the political situation?
Yes, what's going
on? I mean, I think unfortunately no. I don't think there's much you can do apart from try and report what's happening as honestly as possible. I mean, I think there's an important. I think what's left of Russian independent media has an important role to try and tell the story of what's happening in Russia as accurately and as honestly as possible. I think that's the most that you can do, and try and. I mean, it's not a sort of conscious goal, but what you're doing is counteracting the narrative from the state-owned media, and that's very important to say. It's not actually like, what Первый канал says it is. It's like it's very different, and this is what's happening, and like this is what might happen, and I think that's the most you can do.
And the second question, like, Viktor Muchnik from Tomsk.
I don't think so.
He is also the founder of Russian television, now temporarily in Yerevan. He said it's very hard if you are outside of Russia and stay in the context what's going on inside, and how long could it stay in this situation, and what is the solution? I left Russia in the middle of May through the Europe, German and Italy, and every media in the country. I tried to find information in this media, and finally in Italy, first I got information that probably the president of Russia has some illness, very strong illness. And is it true, do you think, and what is really the solution for the media first? What do you think?
For media outside?
Yes.
Outside.
What should happen?
What should...
That you can...
well, I mean, it's very difficult, like, to report on a country from outside the country. I think, I mean, to a certain extent, you can use reporters and inside Russia, but, you know, without using their names is usually what happens. So that's one way of, like, remaining in the context, is to have some people on the ground. Apart from that, you maybe just have to change slightly the way you operate, and you have to constantly bear in mind the restrictions, the fact that you're not, you know, in the place that you're writing about. You know, whether that, I mean, inevitably that means, I don't know, maybe spending more time on social media, like using different social media networks that, and yeah, spending more time on the phone. I mean, it's difficult. There's no, I don't think there's no single solution, I think.
Let's also speak about the cancel culture around the world. I do understand that it's really difficult to report on Russia from outside Russia, but there are also things to report on outside Russia for Russia. And the cancel culture is really one of the topics that interests a lot of people. What are the trends, to your knowledge, I mean, now? Because 2 months ago it was the top topic around the globe. And what are the trends now?
In cancel culture?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the Moscow Times is, like, we write about Russia. That's like our, that's what we focus on. So that's Russia, and then since the beginning of the invasion, it's also been Russians abroad, the wave of emigration, and writing about what Russians are doing in other places, and, you know, Russians who have left and what they're doing and what they're thinking and so on. In terms of cancel culture, I mean, it's not really something that exists in Russia as far as I'm really aware. I mean, certainly not in the same way that it exists in the West. So it's not really something we've covered. I mean, it's something Putin talks about a lot as something terrible about about Western democracy, but it's not something really that has really translated into Russia, you know, that I'm aware of. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much for listening.